All right, let's jump right into this explainer on the corporate empire built on blood and nutmeg. We're talking about a forgotten company that was, believe it or not, once bigger than Apple and Microsoft combined. Think about an entity possessing its own army, its own laws, and the power to control the globe for 2 whole centuries. It's a completely wild story of the world's first true corporate empire.
$7.9 trillion. To really wrap our heads around the sheer scale of the Dutch East India Company, or VOC, just imagine a peak valuation of almost $8 trillion. That is a truly unfathomable amount of wealth. And what's crazy is that this massive corporate empire all started simply because 16th century Europeans finally discovered that food could have flavor, thanks to crusaders returning from the Middle East.
That kicks off our first section, the ultimate spice race, finding the flavor. You see, in the race to find that flavor, spices like pepper, cloves, and especially nutmeg weren't just everyday cooking ingredients. They were the ultimate luxury status symbol. But actually acquiring them came with a massive supply chain problem for the European aristocracy. You basically had 2 options. Option A, you could pay Venice and the Ottoman Empire an absolute fortune on the Silk Road. The prices there were marked up so incredibly high, you'd basically have to trade a kidney just for a handful of nutmeg. Or option B, you could find a direct sea route around Africa. Portugal actually did this first and came back absurdly rich. And for a while, the Dutch were perfectly happy just buying their spices directly from the Portuguese. Well, that sparked a timeline of absolute chaos. In 1580, Spain conquered Portugal, and since they were in the middle of a war with the Dutch, they completely cut off the Dutch spice supply. So the Dutch were forced to find their own way. By 1595, a guy named Cornelis de Houtman led a scurvy-ridden voyage to Indonesia. It was a total disaster. Men went blind, their teeth fell out, and he was so abrasive he ended up in a Japanese prison. But he proved the route was real. This sparked such chaotic free market competition among Amsterdam merchants that prices totally crashed. Finally, in 1602, the Dutch government stepped in and forced every single rival company into one massive entity, the VOC. Moving into our next section, the first megacorporation, the birth of the IPO. Now, the crucial thing to understand here is that this wasn't just a regular trading company. The government literally gave the VOC sovereign powers. They were legally allowed to mint their own money, build massive stone forts, declare war, and even execute people, all in the name of trade. To fund this absolute monster of an operation, they needed serious capital. So they literally invented the stock market as we know it today, creating the initial public offering, or IPO. For the very first time in history, anyone could buy a piece of a company. We're talking widows, bakers, and servants pouring their life savings in. And as everyday shareholders, they demanded just one ruthless thing in return: massive profits driven by a total market monopoly. Which brings us to a really dark chapter. Section 3, Monopoly by Massacre, the nutmeg real estate. Their strategy to achieve this monopoly was brutally simple. They focused entirely on a few tiny volcanic islands in the middle of the ocean called the Banda Islands. Why? Because this was literally the only place on the entire planet where highly prized nutmeg grew. For centuries, the local Bandanese people were free agents, selling to whoever had the catch, but the VOC wanted all of it. If the VOC was a modern startup, its new governor general, Jan Pieter Zoon Koen, was a ruthless CEO who unequivocally chose 600% margins over diplomacy. When locals resisted giving up their entire livelihood, Koen executed a complete massacre. He burned villages to the ground, destroyed food supplies, and in one horrific instance, publicly beheaded 44 village elders right in front of their families as a warning. The human cost of this monopoly was just absolutely staggering. Before Koen arrived with his soldiers and mercenaries, there were 14,000 Bandanese people living on those islands. When he left, barely 1,000 remained. They essentially emptied the islands just to secure their dominance in the market. But by doing this, Koen created a massive new problem for himself. They had killed almost everyone who actually knew how to grow and harvest the nutmeg. So how did the VOC fix it? They repopulated the islands with enslaved people from Java and convicts, dividing up the land into parcels for Dutch colonists. They basically turned the entire area into a giant open-air prison plantation just to maintain those unbelievable bloody profit margins. All right, next up, the intra-Asian money engine, an infinite money glitch. By the 1630s, the VOC completely pivoted. They weren't just a trading company anymore. They became a floating empire controlling the vital choke points of Asia.
While other European powers were hauling their own gold and silver all the way from home to buy spices, the VOC figured out a brilliant, if ruthless, economic loop. Here's how it worked. They would buy commodities super cheaply in one Asian market, flip them for a massive markup in another Asian market where they were scarce, and then use those local profits to buy the high-value spices, tea, and silk. Finally, they'd sail back to Amsterdam with cargo that essentially cost them absolutely nothing in European gold. It was basically an infinite money glitch.
Running that cycle for decades created the richest company in human history. Just listen to these peak assets. They commanded 150 merchant ships, 40 warships, 50,000 employees, and a private army of 10,000 soldiers. And what about those everyday shareholders back in Amsterdam? They were getting an ecstatic 40% dividend on their original investment. But, of course, nothing lasts forever. Section: Corruption and Collapse, Rotting from the Inside. While the grandmas and bakers back home were getting rich, the entire system was secretly falling apart. The VOC was overseen by a board called the 17 Gentlemen, and their fatal flaw was that they completely, utterly refused to audit their own books. It's actually kind of hilarious how bad the VOC was at stopping internal theft. 10,000 miles away from headquarters, employees realized nobody was watching them. Private trading ran rampant. Official company cargo was constantly lost to mysterious shrinkage. And when firing employees failed to send a message, the company essentially threw its hands up. They literally resorted to taxing their employees' corruption instead of stopping it. All the while, they were quietly borrowing cash just to keep paying out those massive dividends so they could avoid a public riot. The beginning of the end really kicked off when the world started catching up. A leaner, meaner English East India Company started stealing market share by focusing heavily on tea and Indian textiles. And then came the final insult. In the 1770s, French smugglers pulled off the Great Nutmeg Heist. They successfully snuck in and stole live nutmeg seedlings right from under the Dutch. Nutmeg started growing elsewhere, the global monopoly shattered, and prices completely tanked. By 1799, the walls had closed in entirely. The British Navy blockaded their ports, and the VOC went from a multi-trillion-dollar empire to holding 134.8 million guilders in debt. To put that into perspective, that's roughly $6 billion today. On New Year's Eve of 1799, the world's first megacorporation was officially dissolved. Game over. This brings us to our final section, the brutal legacy, sanitized history. Now, you might think the collapse of the VOC meant the end of the suffering in Indonesia, right? Well, you'd be wrong. The Dutch government simply stepped in, took over the company's assets, and doubled down on the brutality. In 1830, they rolled out this horrific initiative known as the cultivation system. It was pure state-sponsored extortion. It required 20% of all village land to be used to grow cash crops for the Dutch. Farmers were literally forced to stop growing food for their own families just to produce sugar for Dutch tea sets. The contrast is just sickening. While the European elite enjoyed their luxuries, the result was massive, devastating famines where hundreds of thousands starved to death in fields surrounded by crops they weren't legally allowed to touch. And the kicker? This system brought the Netherlands back from the brink of national bankruptcy. And yet, for literally centuries, this dark history was swept under the rug. In the Netherlands, children were taught about a golden age of prosperity, maritime dominance, and heroic exploration. The slavery and the genocides, they were hidden away in the footnotes, sanitizing the truth of what the VOC truly was, one of history's most ruthlessly efficient machines for turning human suffering into financial dividends. I want to leave you with this chilling quote from the VOC's ruthless CEO, Jan Pieterszoon Koon. "We cannot make trade without war, nor war without trade." It's a stark reminder, and it forces us to ask, how much of our modern corporate world, from our stock markets right down to our global supply chains, was actually built on this exact bloody foundation?